Ringrazio a Gabriele e Pilar per l'invito e capisco che Cinzia parlerà in inglese. Certo?
Sì, sì.
Quindi cominciamo la presentazione in spagnolo e poi continuamos a parlare en inglés. Buenas tardes, entonces soy Claudia Marsico de la Universidad de Buenos Aires y me toca coordinar nuestra última sesión. Vamos a escuchar a Cinzia Arruzza. Cinzia es profesora asociada de filosofía en la New School for Social Research y en el Eugene Lang College, ambos en New York. Es autora de A Wolf in the City, Tyranny and the Tyrant in Plato's Republic, publicado en Oxford University Press en 2018. Y además es coautora de un texto muy conocido, Feminismo para el 99%, un manifiesto que se ha traducido en alrededor de 30 idiomas, lo cual no es nada poco, y toca muchísimos temas sensibles y muy discutidos en estos días. Hoy va a hablarnos de Philosopher-Queens, a Social Reproduction, Reading of the Abolition of the Oikos in Plato's Republic, Book 5. Per piacere, Cinzia, ti ascoltiamo.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction and also to the organizers of the conference for the invitation. And I'm sorry I'm speaking in English, but it has become a bit of a habit because I've been living in the United States for 10 years now. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to focus on rereading the first two waves in Republic Book 5, and contrasting them with, especially with some passages from Xenophon, in particular the Economicus and the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians. Now, in Republic Book 5, Socrates puts forward a set of arrangements meant to complete the discussion concerning the upbringing and formal life of Callipolis' guardians. These arrangements are presented as two distinct yet closely connected waves of laughter, a probable reference to the laughter induced by the analogous depiction of women's irruption into the public sphere, into the political sphere, and reconfiguration of marriage relations in Aristophanes' Assemblywomen. Yet, as Socrates warns his interlocutors, his proposals ought to be meant seriously, and the reasons for which we may be inclined to find them ridiculous ought to be examined critically, for they may be the mere consequence of cultural habits at odds with natural requirements. The proposed arrangements include women sharing in the education, activities, and public offices in which male guardians participate, and the institution of eugenic marriage rules and collective upbringing of children. Now, this section of the Republic has prompted wildly divergent interpretations among feminist readers. It has been welcomed by some radical feminists as putting forward a program for women's emancipation from subjection to the patriarchal family, while it has been rejected by liberal-minded feminists as replacing subjection to the patriarchal nuclear family with subjection to the patriarchal state, or has not been motivated by a concern for women's individual rights or well-being at all. Other aspects of these proposals have also been a target of feminist critique. For example, the elimination of sexual difference and the universalization of the aggressive masculine ethos and lifestyle of male guardians, or the devaluation of women's specific work and activities, and the denial to female guardians of the pleasure and joy inherent in raising their own children. This dispute has often been framed around the question of whether Plato and the proposals put forward in Book 5 of the Republic can be considered as feminist or proto-feminist. Now, I would like to begin my contribution by eschewing this question altogether. And the problem, in my view, is not simply the anachronism of trying to assess whether Plato fits the feminist bill. Investigations of the text framed in these terms, so around the question whether Plato was a feminist, at least in the Republic, these investigations tend to tell us more in my view, about the specific feminist commitments and understanding of gender on the side of the contemporary interpreter than about the nature and structure of the argument in the Republic. For example, to explain this more clearly, to criticize Plato for the elimination of sexual difference in the Republic and for the devaluation of women's specific areas of activities or nurturing inclinations already indicates an interpreter's commitment to a positive evaluation of sexual difference, which represents only one of the available theoretical positions within a contemporary feminist debate, which is profoundly divided precisely on this question. So in my paper, I will leave aside altogether the question whether Plato's proposal can count as feminist or not. And for this reason, I will not really be concerned with the issue of the masculinist language that Socrates deploys in his treatment of the abolition of the Oikos. I take for granted that Plato was a child of his own age, in spite of the wild anti-conformism and radicality of his proposals. So what I intend to explore is rather to what extent and in what way Socrates' proposals in Book 5 subvert the terms of both the Athenian and the Spartan conceptualizations of a woman's ergon, and in this way indicate an understanding on Plato's side of the material pressures and constraints that given social arrangements entail for women's possibility of fulfilling their own nature. So I will do so by focusing on the question of the social organization of women's reproductive work and on the way in which Socrates rewrites, in my view, the relation between a woman's ergon and ponos, at least in Book 5. And as I already mentioned, I will do this by contrasting what happens in Book 5 with Xenophon's conceptualization of women's work on the one hand, and with the provisions included in the Spartan Constitution on the other. So Anne Carson has called attention to an interesting difference in the way Greeks tended to conceptualize sex aimed at procreation versus sex aimed at sexual pleasure. And she emphasizes the frequency of terms referring to work or labor in reference to procreative sex, in contrast with the paideia, the playful character or the game of erotic dalliance. So the procreative sexual act is often referred to in terms of ponos, ergon, or kamnos, with analogies with the labor of sowing the land, plowing, and so on. So procreative sex is work, both on the side of the man and of the woman involved, generating a tangible product, the offspring, that will continue an Oikos lineage. Now I'm going to share my screen, if I manage to, in order to be able to show you the handout. Okay. Okay. Oh. Sorry. I don't know if you can see it. I guess not. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about this. I hope you can see it now. I wanted just to give you, first of all, this short passage from Hippocrates on regimen, where precisely Hippocrates uses the language of ponos to refer to the sexual act. So sexual intercourse reduces, moistens, and warms, It warms owing to the fatigue, tomponon, and the excretion of moisture. It reduces owing to the evacuation. It moistens because of the remnant in the body of the matters melted by the fatigue, to ponu again. So in the case of women, the ponos of procreative sexual intercourse is placed on a continuum with the ponos of pregnancy, and after this, with that of child rearing. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, for example, Socrates describes the extenuating labor performed by his wife and mother of his children. This is the second text in the handout. Of course, you don't suppose that lust provokes men to beget children when the streets and the brothels are full of means to satisfy that. We obviously select for wives the women who will bear us the best children and then marry them to raise a family. The man supports the woman who is to share with him the duty of parentage and provides for the expected children whatever he thinks will contribute to their benefit in life, and accumulates as much of it as he can. The woman conceives and bears her burden in travail, risking her life and giving of her own food. And with much labor, having endured to the end and brought forth her child, she rears and cares for it, although she has not received any good thing, and the baby neither recognizes its benefactress nor can make its wants known to her. Still, she guesses what is good for it and what it likes, and seeks to supply these things, and rears it for a long time, putting up with toil day and night, not knowing what return she will get. So as this passage makes clear, as procreative sexual acts have little to do with the aphrodisia, the choice of a wife is not concerned with sexual desire, which could be satisfied with any number of other women offering paid sexual services. Rather, the wife must be selected on the basis of a utilitarian calculation concerning the proper reproduction and maintenance of the oikos. Another passage, this time from Xenophon's Economicus, further adds to what women's work for the oikos entailed, by focusing on the role of the oikos as a productive economic unit. In the Economicus, Xenophon, as Socrates discussed, the science of economia, that is, the proper management of a private estate, with Ischomachus, a landed aristocrat. This text is particularly interesting for the purpose of my argument, because in fact it gives us a paternalistic yet rather sympathetic portrayal of the nature and value of a wife's work, which probably takes inspiration from the greater autonomy enjoyed by Spartan women in the management of their husbands' estates, compared to Athenian women. In Ischomachus' discourse, sexual difference is presented in terms of complementarity for the sake of performing the different but equally necessary duties that nature has allotted to men and women. This is my third text in the handout. For it seems to me, wife, that the gods with great discernment have established this kind of yoking on male and female, as they are called, chiefly in order that they may form a perfect partnership in mutual service, so eisten koinonia. In the first place, so that the various species of living creatures may not become extinct, the couple lies down together for the production of children. Secondly, offspring to support them in old age is provided by this union, at any rate to human beings. Thirdly, human beings do not live in the open air like cattle, but obviously need shelter. Nevertheless, those who mean to obtain produce to fill the shelter need someone to work at the outdoor occupations, since plowing, sowing, planting, and grazing are all such outdoor jobs, and this supply the necessary provisions. And as soon as all of this is stored in the shelter, then someone else is needed to keep it and to work at what must be done indoors. Shelter is needed for the nursing of newborns. Shelter is needed for the making of grain into bread. and likewise for the making of clothes from wool. And these are the typical productive activity that are attributed to or considered as specifically feminine activities within the domestic sphere. And since both the indoor and the outdoor jobs demand work and care, ergon kai epimeleias, the god from the first adapted the woman's nature, I think, to the indoor, and man's to the outdoor works and cares. So, as you may see from this longish text that I quoted, in Xenophon's discussion of estate management, the distinct work that nature has allotted to women is conceptualized in terms of ergon, which in my view encapsulates the meanings of work, function, and vocation. Women's proper tasks reflect the natural features that distinguish them from men. These features concern not only their bodies, which are, I quote, less capable of enduring cold and heat and journeys and campaigns, but also their emotions and predispositions. I'm going to show you text number 4 of the handout, still from the Economicus. And knowing that he had created in the woman and had imposed on her the nurture of the newborns, he meted out to her a larger portion of affection for newborns than to men. And since he imposed on the woman the protection of what had been brought in as well, knowing that for protection a fearful disposition is no disadvantage, the god meted out a larger share of fear to the woman than to the man. The conclusion of Ischomachus' discourse invites Socrates and the readers to a positive evaluation of sexual difference, as both dictated by nature and beneficial to the requirements of human life, which demands both a distinction and a functional relation between public and private sphere, outdoor and indoor. Text number 5. Just a few lines later from the Economicus. And just because they are not equally well endowed with all the same aptitudes, they have the more need of each other, and each member of the pair is the more useful to the other, the one being competent where the other is deficient. Thus, for the woman, it is more seemly to stay indoors than to be outside, but to the man, it is unseemly rather to stay indoors than to tend to business outside. Now, the reason why I wanted to read these passages from Xenophon is that it seems to me that in Xenophon's view, the partnership, the koinonia of man and woman in the Oikos is predicated on sexual difference and complementary functions or tasks. So the interpretation of women's reproductive ponos within the private Oikos as corresponding to a set of different natural inclinations than those of men can also be observed, for example, in medical literature, for example, in the Hippocratic corpus, where, in fact, we find the idea that sexual reproduction is not only beneficial, but even necessary for a woman's health, given the female body's tendency toward accumulating liquids in excess and the associated dangers of developing a condition labeled as the wandering womb. Moreover, this view is implicit in Athenian laws concerning marriage, which were especially concerned with not squandering Athenian women's reproductive capacities. As the city's public and political sphere could be maintained only on the basis of a proper organization and management of its private foundations in a given number of oikoi, which provided much needed economic resources to the institution of the polis, as well as new generations of citizen warriors. In the law, an Athenian woman's role was always tackled from the viewpoint of her reproductive work and what it entailed for the continuity of the oikos. Just to give some examples, we know that marriages were often endogamic, precisely to avoid, excessive division of the property. Childlessness was a main cause of divorce. Epikleroi could be forced to divorce their husbands in order to marry the next of kin and ensure the continuity of their paternal oikos, but they could not directly inherit the paternal estate, so they could not have independent ownership of the paternal estate. And a husband was legally obliged to divorce her wife in case of adultery, for a woman's adultery jeopardized both past and future claims to legitimate offspring, and therefore inheritance rules and the proper continuation of the husband's oikos. Now, as is well known, the Spartan Constitution, which included a rather different social organization of sexual and social reproduction, is one of the sources of inspiration for the collectivistic arrangements of Callipolis and for Socrates' handling of the so-called female drama. Among the provisions included in Spartan laws, as far as we know at least, some present a striking similarity with the arrangements discussed in Book 3 and in Book 5 of the Republic. In particular, we can think about three provisions within Spartan laws that are relevant from this viewpoint. The first was the institution of obligatory common meals for Spartan citizens and obligatory common lodgements for men from the age of 7 until the age of 30. Secondly, the public education of Spartan children and the extension of public education, including physical training, to Spartan girls as well. And thirdly, the conceptualization of sexual procreation in terms of a eugenic art of child-making for the benefit of the city and the consequent meddling of the law in sexual intercourse. So in the Spartan Constitution, the private oikos was greatly weakened for the sake of strengthening the city as the main site of its citizens' affective identification. This arrangement had as a consequence greater spaces of freedom and autonomy for Spartan women, including the crucial right to privately own and dispose of land. So Spartan women not only could be landowners, they could actually sell their land. Moreover, Sparta's reliance on the forced labor of its oppressed and exploited farming population, the helots, freed the Spartan women from the necessity of menial labor within the oikos, such as woolworking, which by contrast, as we have also seen in Xenophon's Economicus, was considered in Athens an eminently feminine craft and one in which it was honorable for free Athenian women to engage. Although Xenophon tends to agree with the Spartans that in fact woolworking could be actually be left to slave women rather than given to Athenian women. As I mentioned, the different social arrangements organizing sexual reproduction and children rearing confer more power and voice to Spartan women. For example, the fact that the man could not live in a private house until he reached the age of 30, even if he was already married and had children, left women largely in charge of the management of his estate and strengthened the bond between mothers and their sons, because children would live until the age of 7 in the oikos with their mothers, but not with their father. Yet, even in the Spartan Constitution, the role of Spartan women within the polis was firmly defined in terms of their crucial function in reproducing citizen warriors. In Xenophon's Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, eugenic child-making is the overarching principle organizing the social arrangements concerning marriage, sexual intercourse, the education of girls, and women's domestic work. In fact, eugenics and the city's interest in children-making are presented as the source of beneficial measures for women, as, for example, a better and more nutritious diet than what was reserved to Athenian girls. And eugenics also justified the practice of wife sharing. I'm going to read this passage from the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians. In addition to this, he withdrew from men the right to take a wife whenever they chose, and insisted on their marrying in the prime of their manhood, believing that this too promoted the production of fine children. It might happen, however, that an old man had a young wife, and he observed that all men keep a very jealous watch over their young wives. To meet these cases, he instituted an entirely different system by requiring the elderly husband to introduce into his house some men whose physical and moral qualities he admired in order to beget children. On the other hand, in case a man did not want to cohabit with his wife, and nevertheless desired children of whom he could be proud, he made it lawful for him to choose a woman who was the mother of a fine family and of a high birth, and if he obtained her husband's consent, to make her the mother of his children. So, while the diminished importance of the private oikos as the basis for inclusion into the public sphere, combined with the exploitation of a large serf population, created the conditions for Spartan women's greater influence and freedom of movement, Spartan laws did not question the notion that a woman's ergon, and therefore her main contribution to the well-being of the city, is to produce healthy, strong Spartan children. And moreover, the persistence of private property of land still conferred a degree of authority to men over Spartan women's reproductive work, as evidenced by this passage I've just read about the practice of wife sharing and the authority that the husband had in this practice. As already mentioned, Socrates presents his proposals concerning women's participation in the education and form of life of the guardians and concerning marriage and child rearing in two distinct waves. Now, a first element I want to draw attention to is that the order of the waves is inverted with respect to Xenophon's presentation of Spartan laws, organizing child-making and women's education. In the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, the education and better diet of women are causally connected to the necessities of eugenics. So the goal is to have healthy children, and for this reason, girls are educated and trained, and they receive a better diet. In Book 5, on the contrary, Socrates takes the opposite route. The argument for women's inclusion among the guardians depends on the general argument of the dialogue about justice and precedes the discussion of eugenics. And I'm insisting on this point because in some readings of what is going on in Book 5, especially recently, it has been suggested that, in fact, the overarching principle organizing both the first and second wave is eugenics. But I do think that the text doesn't support this reading. Now, it is particularly striking that Socrates begins with the inclusion of women in the form of life of the guardians, especially if one considers that the education of women is not the question that Polemarchus, Adeimantus, and Thrasymachus ask Socrates at the beginning of Book 5. In fact, the question they raise is that of the common possession of women and children, which Socrates had briefly mentioned at 423E, 424A. Socrates' reply, however, does not begin with the common possession of women and children. It begins with women's participation in the guardian's form of life and develops arguments, respectively, in defense of its feasibility first and then of its desirability. The argument for the feasibility of the first wave deals with women's nature in such a way as to subvert both the rationale for women's education in the Spartan Constitution and Xenophon's take in the Economicus about the koinonia on men and women. While in the Economicus, as we have seen, this koinonia is predicated upon sexual difference and complementarity of roles, in Socrates' argument, coherently with his definition of justice, koinonia is predicated upon natural equality. And in fact, it is precisely the fact that women as a class do not possess relevant natural differences with men that justifies and indeed requires their distribution into the three classes of the city according to their natural predispositions. And therefore, it requires their sharing in the same form of life and activities as the male guardians if they happen to have a musical or a spirited soul. So I'm going to read a passage from Book 5. Therefore, if the male sex is seen to be different from the female with regard to a particular craft or way of life, we'll say that the relevant one must be assigned to it. But if it's apparent that they differ only in this respect, that the females bear children while the males beget them, we'll say that there has been no kind of proof that women are different from men with respect to what we are talking about. And we'll continue to believe that our guardians and their wives must have the same way of life. In contrast with Xenophon's discussion of sexual difference, Socrates' conclusion is therefore that there are no occupations that are specific either to women or to men. So there are no feminine and masculine occupations. This conclusion entails a radical distinction between biological differences concerning sexual reproduction, which human beings share in common with other mammals, and natural differences pertaining to the soul, which are the only relevant ones in determining what the proper function of an individual with respect to the management of the city is. Taken as a whole, Socrates argues, women are weaker than men, but this is a difference in quantity, not in quality or nature. And moreover, the difference between the class of women and that of men, taken as aggregates, does not preclude that some or several individual women may be better at everything than several individual men. As some women, like some men, are athletic and warlike, lovers of wisdom and spirited, and have a guardian-like nature, they must be employed in occupations that are akin to their nature and not in others. It should also be noted that, as he has not yet introduced the third wave, that is the philosophical rule, the necessity for philosophers to be in power, which will then prompt a new discussion about what philosophy is and a new discussion about education and, let's say, a new educational curriculum. In this section of the dialogue, in the first two waves of Book 5, Socrates is not really making much of the distinction that he has already introduced between rulers and warriors. And most of the activities he mentions have to do with war making and with defense or with physical training. However, this doesn't mean that women can be included only in the activity of the auxiliaries, of the soldiers. Rather, insofar as the inclusion of women among the guardians is established in the first wave, the logic of the argument requires us to consider the discussion about Philosopher-Kings to also apply to Philosopher-Queens, and this is the reason why I chose this title for my paper. So this includes the educational curriculum of Book 7, and therefore the inclusion of women in the study of dialectics. So the point I'm making also, pushing against some readings again of this element in Book 5 is that we do not have details about women's philosophical activities because philosophy has not been introduced yet in the dialogue. It will come in the third wave, but then insofar as Socrates does establish that women have the same nature as men in terms of their soul, I take the whole discussion, the subsequent discussion about the education of philosophical natures to actually apply also to Philosopher-Queens and to women. The argument for the desirability of such an arrangement refers back to the principle according to which a well-ordered city is the one in which each of its members does their own work. So to exclude women from the political sphere or from military defense, under the assumption that their role as childbearers in sexual reproduction represents their fuses and their destiny, would entail a waste of resources, of talents for the city. Now, Julia Ennas has argued that the argument for the desirability of including women among the guardian class is evidence of the fact that Plato's main concern is not with women's happiness, but rather with the city's well-being. And therefore, that Socrates' argument here should be considered just as a utilitarian argument. This assessment, however, in my view, misses the point. The language employed by Socrates in this discussion is, as I already mentioned, that of ergon. And this is a language that he has already deployed earlier in the treatment of the selection and education of the guardians and of the allotment to individuals of different roles according to their nature in Book 2. Now, at the beginning of Book 4, Socrates responds to Adeimantus' objection that he's not making the guardians very happy by forbidding them to own land, fine houses, gold, and silver. And Socrates responds with an argument that connects inextricably together the happiness of the individual and the happiness of the city taken as a whole. So this is a passage from Book 4. With this in mind, we should consider whether in setting up our guardians, we are aiming to give them the greatest happiness, or whether, since our aim is to see that the city as a whole has the greatest happiness, we must compel and persuade the auxiliaries and guardians to follow our policy and be the best possible craftsmen at their own work, and the same with all the others. In this way, with the whole city developing and being governed well, we must leave it to nature to provide each group with its share of happiness. And I take this passage to indicate the fact that the moment in which people are put in the condition of being able to fulfill their natural inclinations within a well-ordered city in which classes and kinds of people do not meddle with the activities of other classes and other kinds of people, this will actually create the conditions for eudaimonia. Of course, not everybody will have the same kind of access or the same kind of degree of eudaimonia. It will have a share of eudaimonia that is given by their own nature. So, taking this response into account, we may read the argument about the desirability of the employment of women as guardians for the well-being of the city as also entailing, rather than excluding, the insight that creating the conditions for women to follow their own nature will make sure that they will have the share in happiness granted to them by their nature as everybody else in the city. Now, the second wave concerning marriage rules and child rearing is introduced by Socrates as necessitated by the first. Insofar as women and men will live together in close proximity, sharing in everything, the necessity arises of avoiding sexual promiscuity, of taming sexual desire, and of organizing sexual reproduction in such a way as to benefit the city. It is therefore a consequence of the elimination of private dwellings and part and parcel of Socrates' argument about the dangers that private oikoi of warriors and rulers represent as the source of lack of unity and as the source of discord within a city. While the establishment of the communal rearing of children is closely connected with this concern, it is also, in my view, connected with the argument developed in the first wave concerning what constitutes a woman's ergon. And this connection can be seen in an interesting exchange between Glaucon and Socrates, in which the language of ponos and paiodopoia, the making of children, is employed. And won't the nurses also see to it that the mothers are brought to the rearing pen when their breasts have milk, taking every precaution to ensure that no mother knows her own child and providing wet nurses if the mother's milk is insufficient? And won't they take care that the mothers suckle the children for only a reasonable amount of time, and that the care of sleepless children and all other such troublesome duties or troublesome work are taken over by wet nurses and other attendants? So here again, the language is ponon, in reference to child rearing and the various duties associated with it. You're making it very easy for the wives of the guardians to have children. And that's only proper. prepei. Now, ponos is often employed in the Republic in reference to work that requires physical effort or pain. In my reading, Socrates' point is that children making and reading are a matter of ponos rather than ergon, at least as far as the guardian women are concerned. They are toil, not vocation, and they do not have a relation to a woman guardian's natural talent. As such, they are an unsuitable activity for women guardians to engage in for long periods of time and beyond strict biological reproductive necessities, as this would once again violate the principle of specialization based on nature, so violate basically the principle of justice. This is the reason why Socrates responds that lifting lifting the burden of paidopoia from women guardians' shoulders is proper, prepei. It is the fitting thing to do. So if this is the case, then I take that the nurses and wet nurses who will take over this labor are not members of the guardian class, but women who are suited to perform this work because of their repetitive nature, and who probably therefore belong to the class of producers and money makers, as it may be indicated by the fact that the reading pen is situated in a separate part of the city. Now, let me sum up this argument. The arrangements of Book 5 are part, in my view, of a debate that presumably involved the members of the Socratic Circle, a debate about women's nature and ergon, and a debate that was shaped by a positive appreciation of the Spartan Constitution. While in Xenophon's Economicus and in the Spartan Constitution, appreciation for women's role and provisions for their well-being and greater autonomy presupposes the centrality of sexual difference and the division of roles and of public and private space, Plato's proposals directly challenge sexual difference and differentiate between a woman's reproductive ponos and her ergon, at least as far women with a silver or golden soul are concerned. So the outcome of this position is a radical inclusion of women in the political sphere, not as mothers of citizen warriors, but rather as citizen warriors and rulers themselves. This inclusion, and this is my last point, it should be noted, is materially enabled by the guardian class's reliance on the labor of the producers and money makers, which will take on the necessary ponos of sexual reproduction. Thank you. I think you're muted.
Yes. Thank you for an amazing words, Cinzia. We have some time for questions. I begin with two connected questions. First, you mentioned Xenophon works, especially Economicus and the Spartan Constitution. Could you tell something more about the relation with Plato's Republic, and beyond that, about the role of the Spartan model in Plato regarding women? And the second, I was thinking of the case of Aeschines Aspasia, where mutual dependence is emphasized and does not seem to be sexual difference. Women are queens, warriors, politicians, and also sage women. In this sense, do you think Plato's position represents a broader line among the Socratics? That is, how special is Plato's position in the general intellectual framework?
Okay. So on the first issue, I mean, my suspicion is that Plato is responding to Xenophon's Economicus because some terms recur. I mean, there are frequent terms like koinonia and so on, but in the way in which the argument is structured and the terms Plato is using in Book 5, my suspicion is that there may be a bit of a debate with Xenophon. However, I would need to do, I mean, I cannot propose this as a certainty. I would need to do a fair amount of philological work to be able to actually, and this is, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, this is the very first step of a work in progress. So these are really very provisional arguments and conclusions I'm offering, and a lot of more work would be needed, precisely also to respond to the question you asked also about Aeschines. But I do think that there is something interesting going on within the Socratic, let's say, circle and debate. And in fact, Socrates, also the Socrates, in spite of, of his low opinion of his wife, but his positive evaluation of his wife, painstaking work in response to, his son's complaints, and other passages, and as well as the idea that virtue is one. So in other words, we do not have a virtue that is specific to men, a virtue that is specific to women, and a virtue that is specific to slaves, and so on. But there is only one virtue in which all virtuous people participate. My sense is that there is something interesting to be researched further within the Socratic circle in terms of debate about women, their proper role within the polis, and so on. And I take this to be, what I suggest, but again, this is a very provisional suggestion, that this may indeed be due to the influence that the Spartan model had. So in other words, the contrast that they could draw between the way in which women played a more active role within Sparta, and the conceptualization and also the legal framework for women's lives in Athens. So I take this to be related to their, Philo-Spartan positions, let's say, to the general Philo-Spartan positions that were shared within the Socratic circle. But again, I think I do need a fair amount of additional work to build a proper case for this reading.
It's an interesting line. There is a question from Gabriele. He says, simple questions, Cinzia, and yet I understand a probably huge one. Would be Plato open to this kind of more gender equal deployment of women as guardians? What would be the drive for him to challenge sexual difference?
Okay. So in my view, the philosophical reason, the philosophical rationale for this is Plato's insistence on the centrality of the soul in defining what a person's nature is, and therefore the devaluation, in a sense, to a certain extent, of embodiment. Now, sexual difference has to do, at least because of course we know that in other dialogues, Socrates doesn't take this position, or in the Timaeus doesn't take this position. So it is unclear whether this is a position that is consistently held by Plato throughout the dialogue. But at least in staying with the Republic, I think it has to do with his general argument about the differences among souls, and about the soul as the criterion for classifying people. So in the argument in Book 5, the idea is that sexual reproduction and therefore the difference in reproductive apparatuses and so on is something that has just to do with the body, but doesn't really concern the soul. So I take this to be, let's say, the philosophical, let's say, thrust of the argument. An additional element has to do with the fact that clearly, the sharing in common of the way of life of the guardians by women comes after the abolition of private property, because private property of land and the abolition of private dwellings already takes place at the end of Book 3. So already, at the end of book 3, we find that the guardians are not going to own any silver, any money, any private dwellings, and so on and so on. This somehow, in my view, weakens the necessity of having, so the abolition of private property basically weakens the necessity of maintaining sexual difference for the sake of the city, for the sake of the order of the city. But again, in philosophy, so I think this is part of the reason, but what is interesting to me is that in the philosophical argument that Plato articulates in the first wave, this is not the issue. So the issue is really like to insist, to emphasize the fact that women and men do not have differences in terms of soul as, classes of people. And this, of course, since we have already discussed virtues in book 4, so we have already had Socrates' presentation of the 4 virtues. This also means that women participate exactly in the same virtues as men. So we can have, brave women, and it's not a different kind of bravery. Wise women, and it's not a different kind of Sophia, and so on.
Great. There is another question from Valeria Sona. She says, what is your opinion on Susan Sett's claim that the common position of women by men is an essential part of a strategy that aims to seal the unity of the group and guardians into a unified family? She also claims that this transformation is made possible by an obliteration of biological maternity in favor of a symbolic paternity.
Yeah. Okay. So the question of the unity of the guardians, of the group of rulers is clearly the key issue behind the abolition of private property, and therefore then the abolition of the Oikos. However, what I hope I have tried, and I'm aware of this argument, and I was basically indirectly responding to this. What I hope I have shown is that, in fact, the argument about the education of women is independent of this issue. So, in other words, let's imagine a different kind of situation in which, the Oikos is abolished, the private property is abolished. We only have male guardians who need to reproduce, obviously. But they reproduce by resorting to the collective sexual reproductive labor of women who are qualified for this kind of job, without needing women's participation in the education and rule, in the education of the guardians and in ruling the city. So, in other words, the goal of the unity of the polis can be achieved simply with the abolition of the private oikos, and by having rules for sexual reproduction that do not necessarily require women's participation in education, women's participation in war-making activities, and women's participation in philosophy. Also, I think what I suggested is that we should read the subsequent discussion of what philosophy is, and especially in book 7, the new educational curriculum, as applying also to women, because otherwise the argument becomes inconsistent, incoherent. If this is the case, what somebody is saying is that there are women who can contemplate the form of the good, who can be trained for 5 years in dialectics and so on. This is entirely unnecessary for the sake of the unity of the polis itself. Now, the other issue in terms of biological maternity in favor of symbolic paternity, I'm not sure why in favor of symbolic paternity. I think it is, yes, it is the obliteration of biological maternity, but also biological paternity. So the whole lineage is broken, because both men and women will be unable to know who their biological offspring is. So they will be unable to recognize their biological children. And then, again, in spite of the masculinist language that Socrates employs, and so we have, frequent references to the father bringing the children to the battlefield to, expose them to the reality of war and so on. In spite of this, again, the logic of the argument requires us to read, where he speaks of fathers, to read actually also mothers. In other words, both parents, actually the collective parents, let's say, will bring their collective children to the battlefield. Now, I do understand that this may be entirely unpalatable to some feminist readers, in the sense of, denying, I don't know, like the biological bond between a mother and a child, a bond that is then cultivated through lactation, child rearing, and so on. But what I argued at the beginning of my paper is that these kind of readings obviously reflect the feminist commitments of the interpreter. So in other words, you need to believe as a feminist that the biological bond between a mother and a child is key to a woman's life, and it is crucial in order to put forward this criticism of Plato. And it is perfectly acceptable criticism, but in my view, it risks to somehow do some violence to the text, and B, it risks to present one's own view of feminism, or what of gender relations, and what the relationship between parental relationships amount to basically present this as the feminist view. And what I'm suggesting is that we should be a bit more cautious, and that very often, and this is the case in general with the interpretations of Plato's Republic, very often our own readings of the Republic reflect more our own political, theoretical, political, philosophical commitments than what Plato is saying. And this is the reason why the dialogue has been interpreted in wildly divergent ways. So, just to sum up, I let's say I disagree exegetically with the first point made by Susan Said. I think the text doesn't support this. And I can see the rationale for the second point, but I also think, yes, but in order to put forward this criticism and attack what Plato is doing, you need to have a certain kind of commitment to what counts as a good life for a woman, basically, involving biological maternity and maintaining the biological bond with the natural child.
Very clear. Enrique Santana says, do you see any recurrence of this Platonic thought on women in Hellenistic sources?
I honestly am unable to respond to this question. I would need to do some work, especially on Stoic utopias and so on. So that's actually a great question, but I don't know in Hellenistic sources, to be honest.
Okay. Isadora wanted to participate in the talk. Isadora?
Hi. So I have a question. At first, it will seem very silly what I'm going to ask, but then I will explain myself. I would like to know the impact of Plato's in this ancient Greek society. I mean, I know the impact for us is huge because we have like this historiography that puts a lot of thoughts. I don't know how can I say this. A lot of works are based in this philosophic thoughts, and now we have this a new kind of way of thinking. For example, I don't know if you were seeing like Agatha's work presentation, but she was talking about this book about Bloch, that she talks how the tradition used Aristoteles for a long time to talk about like being a citizen as a political thing, and I'm actually, I was thinking during your talk, like how the people that live in the same age Aristotle receive sorry, not Aristotle, Plato. Yeah, Plato received actually this kind of embate between Xenophon and this aristocracy, actually. Because, I mean, I don't know, do you think that it has some influence in the laws? How do people see each other? Does it have a more broad aspect than just like this circle from you know, people that are literate, like, you know, these literate people?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say, obviously, for the reason, some of the reasons also explained by Violaine Sebiot-Cuchet this morning. But I mean, what we have access to is, in terms of, you know, textual sources, are, you know, precisely like sources. So in other words, what we may, you know, assess through philology and so on, the impact that Plato's ideas may have had on other contemporary philosophers of his time, or writers like Isocrates and so on. And this would be interesting work to do, and it is interesting work that has been done. But it is very difficult to assess what kind of influence Plato's own ideas may have had on the population at large. I personally doubt that Plato's dialogues were circulating beyond, let's say, a relatively narrow circle of people interested in philosophy, in intellectual debate, and literate enough to read them. So from this viewpoint, I doubt that there was an actual influence of these ideas in Athenian laws. And Athenian laws about marriage actually remain rather, you know, constant throughout, you know, the second half of the 5th century and 4th century. The only element that changes is the citizenship law, that is basically increasing after being introduced by Pericles. So the fact that basically both parents needed to be Athenians in order to transmit citizenship to their children. So we know that, you know, the law was introduced, was probably you know, held in place in a rather strict way for a period of time, and then started being weakened over the course of time. But I doubt that this was again an effect of what Plato is doing. So I think that the Book 5 of the Republic has probably played a great role in the feminist imagination, because some of the arguments for the natural equality based on the soul and the insistence that, you know, women have the same abilities and so on can be found in different terms, obviously, in the Querelle des Femmes, and then subsequently in, you know, emancipationist first wave feminism. And I think there is a bit of a lineage. So it is a form of feminist intervention that insists not on positively evaluating sexual difference, but rather on insisting that sexual difference is much less relevant than one may think, and they rather insist on on equality, let's say. So I think we can retrace the influence that this kind of argument, this kind of approach plays on the modern and then first wave feminist debate. But it's very hard. At least I'm unable to. I doubt that this position could have had an influence over large groups of people who were not literate and so on.
Thank you very much for your answer. I was just wondering because, I mean, we have like this huge tradition that takes these dialogues, not only, like these philosophers, in a very normative way. Then, I was just wondering this, but thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah, there may be. I mean, again, I think some work would be. I would like to do some work on the influence rather than Socrates may have had. But again, it's not the influence at large. So in a large public, on a large public, and so on. But rather, the influence that the Socratic, Socrates' viewpoint may have had on various different Socratic thinkers. Because, for example, we do find in a completely different context this common participation in the same form of life in the Cynics, where a woman can live precisely like a Cynic philosopher, at the outskirts of the city, rejecting private property, every kind of private possession, and so on and so on. So this but again, it seems to me that the Cynic position, for example, was certainly a very marginal minority position within Athens.
You have turned to the question about Hellenistic influence. No, just a joke. You ended answering the question about Hellenistic influence of Plato.
Right. Although I think it is influence of probably Socrates more than Plato.
Yes.
And, this commonality of life takes place completely. One is the well-ordered city in which everybody occupies their own place, and the other is living according to nature, interpreted in a completely different, opposite manner, which is against the conventions and the laws of the city and so on.
We have another question. What do you think of the paragraph 540c, book 7? My glasses are not working well. When Glaucus says, like a sculptor Socrates, you produce ruling men that are completely fine. Socrates' answer, and ruling women too, Glaucon. It seems that Plato references his proposal at book 5, that is, he insists on familiarizing his contemporaries with the possibility of women in politics.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mentioned at some point that I was not going to, focus on the masculinist language and so on, but now I'm going to say a few words about this, because it's true that, we have a truly, in a sense, revolutionary argument, although I concluded the paper insisting on the fact that all of this is predicated upon the subordination of the producers. So we are only speaking about some women, not all women. Although, it is entirely possible that because of the logic of the argument, even among the class of moneymakers and producers, women will be able to follow their own appetitive vocation. So some women will be doctors, some women may be craftsmen and so on, craftswomen actually, and so on. Now, but it is true that the proposal is couched in this rather masculinist language. And of course, there are different ways one can interpret this. One way is, as I mentioned, Plato is a child of his own age, and so he may be using often the masculine as a universal signifier, so as indicating both men and women. He may, fall back into masculinist ideas, images, and so on. Another hypothesis is also that somehow Socrates is meeting his interlocutors where his interlocutors are. So he has already received some pushback especially from Adeimantus, but in part also from Glaucon, about the abolition of private property. Adeimantus is not happy about this, and tries to challenge the very idea that somebody with no gold and silver and property can be happy. So it may be also the case that somehow, since the Republic is also an education, it's a work of paideia, that somehow Plato is educating his interlocutors, but also meeting them with his use of language where they are. And for interlocutors like Glaucon and Adeimantus, it may be difficult to, imagine another way of thinking about women. Although I must say that Glaucon in particular actually does recognize, when asked by Socrates, that indeed it is possible to observe that some women are better at many things than men, and that indeed there are some women who share, who are musical or philosophical and so on. I do think that this passage in 540c is a reference back to the discussion in Book 5, and Socrates is reminding Glaucon, who is forgetting again, that women are included. That women are included in the whole discussion of what rulings amounts to, what philosophical education amounts to, and so on. So I entirely agree. And this text basically supports the point I'm trying to make, that if we take Plato to be a coherent philosopher, the logic of the argument requires us to read the text in this way.
Yes. And now a question from Flora de Carvalho Mangini. She says, assuming the absolute rarity of the formation and maintaining of the philosophical character in the Republic, would agree that, one, allowing for women to be augments the chance of attaining such a character, and two, further emphasizes this role of education. And as for a feminist contemporary point, it is true that Plato doesn't talk about women's rights, but neither man's. And advocating for women's equal and philosophical education will always be revolutionary, no?
Okay. Yeah, the first point is actually very, I agree. I think it's a very good point. In fact, I do think that this can be seen in the second part of Book 5 and then in Book 6. There is a sincere worry in the Republic about the fact that the wrong political and social conditions may impede the development of philosophy, or the flourishing, let's say, of philosophy. Because we have a whole discussion about the corruption of philosophical natures within the inappropriate social and political conditions. So I do think that there is a real concern throughout the Republic about making philosophy possible, making philosophy flourish, and what can help us do this. And from this viewpoint, it is wasteful to forbid women from studying philosophy, or not to recognize a woman's philosophical talent, because already we have a few philosophical natures. They are a rarity, and philosophical natures can get wasted because of the wrong political and social arrangements, either because they get corrupted, and this is the discussion in Book 6, or in the case of women, because there are false beliefs within the city that organize the life of women, which bar women's access to philosophy. So I completely agree with the first point. On the second point, yes, so to give an example, Julia Anna's very influential article on whether Plato is a feminist or not. One of her criticisms of the proposal, one of the points she makes in order to deny that Plato can be counted as feminist is precisely that we do not find, the various arrangements in Book 5 are not framed in terms of women's rights and of the defense of women's rights. At the same time, there is no speech of rights in the Republic. This is quite alien to the way of thinking about political relations within the Republic. So this applies to men as well. So, but I think she may have a point that that somehow a certain idea about, although I don't know if she has a point. Sorry about this. I'm thinking about while I'm speaking. But let's say that, of course, she has a point that if we take feminism, the contemporary feminists, to have to do with the rights and to be necessarily framed in within the language of rights, then Plato cannot count as a feminist. At the same time, in the same article, Julianus makes another claim, which is not simply that Plato is not a feminist, which, I mean, it's a claim I may well endorse, also because it would be anachronist to think that he was. But she goes far because she actually claims that there is nothing interesting for contemporary feminists in Plato's proposal. So in other words, that there is nothing that should appeal to feminists in Plato's proposal. And on this, as you may have noticed, I actually disagree. I think there is something rather interesting from a feminist perspective going on in Book 5, especially in the insight into the way in which specific material arrangements around sexual reproduction really shape what a woman has the freedom and the leisure time to do. And I think this is actually this is why I called it a social reproduction reading of Book 5. So in other words, I do think we can agree that clearly this is not a feminist text. But this doesn't mean that it is a text that doesn't speak in the least to feminist concerns, contemporary feminist concerns. I already mentioned the fact that this approach actually did have an influence on the development of feminist theory, of feminist thought, especially the line of thought in emphasizing women's abilities as equal to men's abilities and so on. So especially emancipationist feminism. And I do think there is something interesting from the viewpoint of social reproduction feminism going on within the text, with this idea of collective parenthood replacing individual parenthood, for example, as basically a condition to lift the burden of childbearing and sexual reproduction from women. So this is basically to make explicit the way I was trying to read the text. This is basically what I was trying to suggest, that clearly, we should leave aside the question of whether Plato is a feminist or not, but still maintain that there is something specific that Plato is doing with respect to other Socratics, which actually is interesting for us as feminists today.
Yes. Thank you, Cinzia, for your marvelous work and your very clear answers. We have now another question, so we can leave the place to Gabriele and Pilar to the closing of our activity today.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And I'm sorry, I'm just looking at myself on the screen, and I can only see Claudia, and I cannot see any of you.
Thank you, Cinzia, for a very interesting rich conference. And obrigada, graças, Claudia, também pela moderação. Nós podemos, então, encerrar essa jornada. Foi um dia... Assim, eu estou cansada, até estou procurando as palavras, né, da gente estar aqui desde... Enfim, antes de tudo, eu acho que eu preciso agradecer a Fernanda, Isadora e ao Tadeu, que ficaram, de fato, em todas as mesas da jornada, dando suporte para a gente aqui no estúdio. Agradecer, claro, a todas as palestrantes pelos trabalhos riquíssimos que nós vimos aqui. Agradecer a comissão, que tornou possível, novamente, e agradecer também aos nossos espectadores, né, que são também o motivo de todo esse evento. Eu tenho certeza de que as falas de hoje vão continuar animando debates e perguntas, né, mesmo depois da jornada. E para quem perdeu uma mesa ou outra e tem, né, vontade de assistir, as conferências vão ficar disponíveis no canal da Archai. Basta entrar, inscrevam-se no canal, né, e vocês têm acesso a todas as mesas de hoje. Obrigada demais, realmente. Foi um prazer enorme, assim, o cansaço que vale a pena, né? Enfim, é isso. Acho que agora a gente pode descansar e comemorar.